Thanks everyone for coming back to our next edition of Econ Talks. And Gareth, we've seen Fonterra today coming out with some pretty exciting news.
Yeah, I mean, there's been questions, I think, about how exports might go in the face of what is a global economy still struggling with the COVID pandemic. But yeah, good news in terms of that Fonterra payout or forecast payout. They're revising that up.
Yeah, so I mean, it's gone from a midpoint of 4.0 per kilogram of milk solids up to $6.8, which is definitely getting back towards what farmers are wanting to see. Very supportive in a sense of that primary sector, which has been a key area of, I guess, maintaining the momentum of our economic conditions here in New Zealand. We've seen tourism fall away. We've seen some of those other sectors in a softer patch, but our primary sector seems to be moving ahead at pace, and that is certainly going to be helpful for getting the economy back on track.
Yeah, there's definitely been a divergence in terms of the fortunes and expected fortunes of those provincial areas, the likes of the agriculturally based ones versus areas such as Queenstown, where tourism is the mainstay of the economy. I mean, you mentioned dairy there, but how are some of the other exports going, such as meat and horticulture?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's always movements month to month, but the general trend is that our primary sector exports, particularly those food-based products, are holding up. We know that those dairy numbers are still in a relatively good position. You look at China, for example, that's where a lot of the demand is still coming through. Now, that's impressive given that Chinese consumer spending has been a little bit softer than we might have expected. So to see them still demanding our milk-based products is an encouraging sign. Across the world, we've seen previously, like earlier in the year, some of our kiwi fruit and other fruit exports doing well, packed with vitamin C. They've really started to get going, and people are looking for those healthier options. Meat's quite an interesting one, though, because we've seen that although it's held up, particularly in the likes of the US, we are having to see a pivot in just how New Zealand exports our meat away from that sort of in-restaurant consumption, some of those more premium cuts, into sort of at-home grocery consumption, because people aren't eating out as much as the pandemic sort of ravages places and locks places down. Similar sort of for wine, we're seeing that people are opting more for those low to medium wines that they can drink at home. And so what we're seeing is that that primary sector is continuing to keep moving, but the way in which it's going is shifting ever so slightly.
When looking forward over the next year or 2 years, I mean, given the uncertainty, there is a outlook. I mean, at the moment, we're facing COVID case numbers that are at record high levels, although that hasn't been accompanied by the same sort of spike in deaths, or proportionately anyway, as we saw back in March and April earlier this year. I mean, what's your sense in terms of how that global economy performs and sort of demand conditions pan out for exporters over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you say, those death numbers haven't started to rise, but the case numbers have. And what we continue to see is that even if places aren't locking down across the world anymore, the fear of catching COVID has limited just how much people are going out. And so at the moment, the global economy is in a tough place. If anything, it continues to get worse. And so I guess that outlook generally for our trade picture is a bit softer. But at the same time, we know the world has to eat, and we know the world has been eating. We can show that through some of our export stats. So it does seem to be that New Zealand's export profile could well hold up better, even though those global conditions remain quite tough. I guess the big question is if we see any difference, changes coming through in terms of the supply of other foodstuffs across the world, does that sort of put New Zealand out of the market, or do we continue to go ahead and trade on that very strong brand, that very healthy brand, I guess, that New Zealand has built up by going hard, going early, and keeping COVID out. But I do think that the likelihood for our exports to remain in such a strong position is likely to weaken as we move forward, just because the world's not going to have as much money to throw around. So there are risks in that regard.
Yeah, it's an interesting key for the New Zealand economy going forward, I think. I mean, we've got an assessment or a view on how domestic activity pans out. We know that tourism, the borders are going to be shut for potentially another year or so. Who knows what the timing around is as a vaccine. But in terms of that primary agricultural stuff and those exports, that is a really important sort of baseline or underlying factor for New Zealand and our ability to grow. So, yeah, an area definitely, I think, to keep watching over the next 6 to 12 months.
Absolutely, and that's the tough thing, right? New Zealand has done incredibly well to get to where we are. We don't have COVID across our country, but elsewhere, those rising case numbers are concerning. And I guess the risk is that New Zealand is a lifeboat essentially floating amongst a sea of pandemic, and so we can only exist by ourselves for so long in many regards. But look, we'll continue to monitor that one as we move forward. Always good to chat and discuss these sort of topics, Gareth. And I'll catch you and everyone else on the next edition of